A man so short and thin that the world laughed at him, until the messenger of God declared that in the scales of eternity, his single leg is heavier than Mount Uhud. Let that sink in for a second. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to be exploring the incredible story of the ultimate underdog, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. His life is an absolute masterclass in how true human value is measured. And spoiler alert, it's not by physical strength or societal backing, but by immense faith and absolute integrity.
Right from the jump, this quote establishes the amazing heroic arc we're about to dive into. We are talking about a man who, by society standards, had literally zero leverage. He had no massive wealth, no tribal protection, and no imposing physical stature. Yet his spiritual magnitude completely eclipsed the giants of his era. To really understand how he got there, we need to go back to the very beginning of his journey, far away from the bustling elite circles of his city.
Out in the rugged, dusty mountain trails of Makkah, a young shepherd lived entirely on the fringes of society. Abdullah belonged to the Bedouin Banu Hudayl tribe, which basically meant he was part of the marginalized, unprotected group in the eyes of the powerful Meccan oligarchy. As a young man, he spent his days in total isolation, tending the flocks of a notoriously cruel chieftain named Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt. He was, for all intents and purposes, completely invisible to the city's elite.
But there is a massive, absolutely stark contrast between his societal status and his inner character. Society just saw a poor, vulnerable, physically thin man with dark skin, but inside, he was fiercely honest. Despite his intense poverty, he always wore the absolute cleanest white clothes he could manage, and he wore this distinctively sweet-smelling perfume that would literally announce his presence in the dark. So his outer circumstances definitely did not dictate his inner dignity.
And it's exactly this foundation of character that gets put to the test one day out in those mountains. Two thirsty travelers approached him, who happened to be the Prophet Muhammad and Abu Bakr, fleeing persecution at the time. They asked the young shepherd for milk. Now, Abdullah replied that while he wanted to help them, he just couldn't. The sheep were a trust, and he flat out refused to steal from his employer. Impressed by this unwavering integrity, the Prophet asked for a young, barren ewe that had never produced milk before. As the Prophet stroked its udder and prayed, milk suddenly began to flow abundantly.
Well, after witnessing this undeniable miracle right in front of his eyes and drinking the milk, Abdullah was captivated. He immediately asked to learn the words the Prophet was speaking. He embraced the faith right then and there, earning the prestigious title Sudus el-Islam, which means he became exactly the sixth person on earth to convert to Islam. Think about that. At that moment, this humble shepherd was literally 1/6 of the entire Muslim population.
And that deep, early conviction built incredible bravery. Back in Makkah, the early Muslims were severely oppressed. Up to this point, the Quraysh leaders had never even heard the Qur'an recited clearly and publicly. Someone had to make them listen, and Abdullah volunteered. Now remember, he was essentially a foreigner with zero tribal protection. His friends warned him that the crowds might actually kill him, but his response? Allah will protect me. He became the very first person after the Prophet to recite the Qur'an publicly.
He just walked right up, stood alone in front of a Kaaba at Maqam Ibrahim, and began to beautifully recite Surah Ar-Rahman. When the Quraysh realized what was happening, they rushed him. They violently mobbed this young man, hitting him in the face and beating him relentlessly until he was bloodied and his collarbone was shattered.
But the truly crucial takeaway here is how he reacted to this brutal violence. When his companions finally rescued him, his spirit was completely unbreakable. Through bruised and bloody lips, he looked at them and said that the enemies of God had never seemed smaller or more insignificant to him than at that very moment. He was fully prepared to walk right back out the next morning and do it all over again. They could break his bones, sure, but they absolutely could not touch his faith.
Fast forward a bit. When the Muslims eventually migrated to Medina, Abdullah transitioned from a mountain shepherd into the ultimate confidant. He practically became the Prophet's shadow. He was given this incredible, unprecedented domestic proximity, acting as a personal servant and earning titles of just the utmost intimacy: the keeper of the sandals, the keeper of secrets, the bearer of the toothstick and travel bedding. He woke the Prophet, shielded him when he bathed, and literally traveled with him everywhere.
His proximity was so constant, so entirely normalized, that outsiders and newcomers to Medina, like the companion Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, mistakenly assumed that Abdullah and his mother were actually part of the Al-Bayt. That means they thought they were the Prophet's literal immediate family. That is how deeply integrated this former outcast had become in the household of the messenger.
Okay, this brings us to what is really the emotional climax of our explainer today. One day, Abdullah was climbing an arak tree to pick a twig for the Prophet to use as a toothstick. As he was climbing up, the wind blew and exposed his incredibly thin, frail legs.
Seeing his thin legs, some of the companions standing around began to laugh. The Prophet saw this and immediately stopped them with a really profound question. Why are you laughing? When they sheepishly admitted they were laughing at the small size of Abdullah's legs, the Prophet issued a rebuke that forever redefined how we should measure human worth.
He looked at them and said, "I swear by Allah, they are heavier on the scales on the day of judgment with Allah than the mountain of Uhud." Think about what this brilliantly illustrates. Why this matters so much for us today is that it completely strips away all of our superficial metrics. In the divine scales, your physical strength, your wealth, your societal backing, they mean absolutely nothing. Immense faith, unbreakable integrity, and a pure character are what actually carry weight. A man society mocked for being small was deemed heavier than a massive mountain.
And we see this triumphant arc fully play out in his life. He goes from being an oppressed, marginalized shepherd in Mecca to the bloodied but brave reciter at the Kaaba, all the way to the dust-filled aftermath of the Battle of Badr. Because at Badr, it was this very same, slight, physically unimposing man who placed his foot right on the neck of Abu Jahl, the greatest tyrant and enemy of the early Muslims, and struck him down. Talk about the ultimate triumph of the underdog.
Later in life, during the caliphate of Umar, Abdullah was sent to the city of Kufa. Umar sent him there as a magistrate, a treasurer, and most importantly, a teacher. Umar famously described him to the people as a box full of knowledge. And Abdullah definitely delivered. He transformed Kufa into this massive center of learning, establishing a legacy that would echo through all of history. To actually quantify that massive intellectual legacy for a second, 848. That is the exact number of hadith narrations he perfectly transmitted. He was so deeply knowledgeable that the Prophet had specifically commanded the community to learn the Qur'an from 4 main teachers, and he listed Abdullah ibn Mas'ud first. Abdullah himself even noted that he knew the context of every single verse ever revealed, just an absolute titan of knowledge. He operated on this beautiful theological maxim: whoever loves the Qur'an will love Allah and His Messenger. His entire school of thought in Kufa, which was built on his incredibly deep understanding, his reasoning, and independent judgment, actually laid the foundational backbone for Islamic jurisprudence. It directly influenced major legal schools like the Hanafi school that still endure centuries later. At the age of about 60, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud passed away in Medina. He was buried in the al-Baqi cemetery at night, with his dear friend Zubair leading the funeral prayers. His life stands as this towering testament that a heart filled with the Qur'an and a life lived with absolute integrity is one that God will always honor, protect, and never, ever forsake. Which leaves us with this final, crucial question to ponder. How do we measure our own weight in the world today? Are we building our legacy on superficial societal status, on how we look, or the titles we hold at our jobs? Or are we building it on the enduring weight of our character, our integrity, and our knowledge? The story of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud shows us exactly which scale actually matters in the end. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparks some curiosity, and I'll catch you next time.